Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone. I hope you and your loved ones are safe. I'm Asavari Sathe, Director Communications and Patients Advocacy at the Organization of Pharmaceutical Producers of India, OPPI. We welcome you all to the third discussion of this virtual scientific and educative knowledge series curated by OPPI in collaboration with International Alliance of Patients Organization, NatHealth, Healthcare Federation of India, the Indian Pharmaceutical Association, and SearPharm Forum, a forum of FIP and WHO with National Pharmaceutical Association of the Southeast Asian region. These 5 associations have joined hands to support the Indian central and state government efforts to ensure dissemination of correct and factual information on COVID-19 and to encourage people to get vaccinated upon their turn. Our campaign, No One is Safe Until Everyone is Safe, was launched on June 14th, and this knowledge series is an extension of this campaign. Our fireside chat today is on the history of pandemics and how they have shaped the world. To know how economies have survived and thrived during pandemics throughout the history, what are the lessons thereof, and what is the role of each of the stakeholders, be it the government, private sector, communities, or societies during this time. We'll also touch upon how each pandemic has brought about a strong environment for collaboration, innovation, and R&D, which in most of these scenarios have resulted in cures, be it through vaccines, medicines, therapies that have helped keep those deadly viruses at bay. We'll also look at how the healthcare has evolved through these pandemics and how the role of the pharma industry has been shaped. We'll culminate our discussion into the pandemic that is wreaking havoc across the world today, that is the COVID-19 virus, and what have been some of the challenges that science has had to face even during the earlier times, and essentially leading on to today's issue around vaccine hesitancy. So without any further ado, let me introduce our speakers. We have with us today Professor Chinmay Tumbe, faculty member at IIM Ahmedabad. Chinmay is passionate about migration, cities, and history, and is an alumnus of the London School of Economics and Political Science and IIM Bangalore. He has been a faculty member at TIS Hyderabad. His first book, India Moving, A History of Migration, was published in 2018, and his latest book is titled Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, How They Shaped India and the World, and was published in 2020. He is also a member of the Lancet COVID-19 India Task Force. A warm welcome to you, Chinmay. Our moderator for this discussion is Vani Manja. Vani is the country managing director for Boehringer Ingelheim BI India and has worked successfully in strategic roles in BI Germany and the United States. In the India role, she is responsible for the company's businesses across India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Her global experience spans nearly 2 decades across healthcare and management consulting from McKinsey & Company, Becton Dickinson, and BI. Her functional experience covers strategy, marketing, sales, business development, general management, and business and cultural transformation. Vani holds an MBA and MA in International Studies from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia and a bachelor's degree in honors in chemistry from Delhi University. A warm welcome to you, Vani. I hand it over to you now to set the context for today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Asavari. Good evening to everyone in the audience, and it's a pleasure to be with you here, Chinmay, today for a virtual dialogue on a topic that's very pertinent to our lives in the context of the pandemic today. We live in a world that has transformed beyond our wildest imaginations just 20 months ago, be it around how we live, work, socialize, celebrate, or travel, having just traveled across 2 continents in the last month, most recently this past weekend from Germany to India. I can tell you the experience looks very different than just the beginning of 2020. The reality is we have learned to adjust and shape the way we live and operate very quickly. And as human beings, we've shown over the times that we survive and thrive through the toughest of times. From a professional perspective, having been associated with the healthcare industry, pharmaceutical in particular, over the last couple of decades, I have always been impressed with what we do in terms of bringing research, therapies to the illnesses that we want to solve for. But these past 20 months have been inspirational in terms of the speed with which we've put out vaccines, therapies, tests and diagnostics, etc., to truly overcome the challenges at hand. From a decade to make a vaccine to bring to market to less than 15, 18 months is quite remarkable. So this context is of personal interest to me. One piece that's important is how do we take the learnings from these experiences to make sure we can take them into future instances? And similarly, how do we take history, learnings from the past to teach us how we can deal with the current challenges better? And what's interesting, Chinmay, from the book you've written right now is clearly there are lessons that are worth looking back more intensely to solve for today's challenges. So kudos to you for having picked up this topic and put out a book around the age of pandemics, reflecting on some of the challenges we faced a century before last, and some of the learnings that are still relevant today. So let's start with a little bit of the context for what motivated you, Chinmay, to write this book.
Great, thanks, Vani, and thanks for the team for having me over. I had studied pandemics in the context of migration, which I've been working on for more than a decade. And in March 2020, my son actually asked me this question, tell me something about past pandemics. And while I could tell him a little bit, I realized with that question that he was also asking something much more. And there was clearly a popular discourse which kind of said that we, A, either had never had pandemics in the past, or B, I was getting WhatsApp forwards such as how our diets were naturally, keeping us outside pandemics, or C, in order to admonish China, there were, forwards which just said that India has never been the source of pandemics in the world. And at the back of my head, I knew that all of this was not true because I had read about cholera, I had read about plague, I had read about influenza, and I knew that those numbers were pretty bad. But remarkably, there's really no book about these pandemics, and the books that have been written are about its impact in Europe and the US. So that's how I really began my research. And I must say, my first book took 10 years to write. This book took 10 months. So it was expedited research written in the lockdown. But what I'm going to do right now is just show you a few slides to give you a glimpse of the book and just some of the themes as to why history has been so important in understanding, especially Indian history of pandemics, to understand how we are dealing with the world today. Right, can you see this?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. India has been here before, and that's the first thing that I want to say. And not only that, that India was the worst affected country in each of the three pandemics, cholera, plague, and influenza, that ravaged the world between 1817 and 1920. Both cholera and plague fades out after the 1920s. Totally, that's 70 million lives. These are conservative estimates. That's more than the number of people who died in World War I and World War II put together. And out of the 70 million people, astonishingly 40 million of those passed away in India. And 20 out of that in influenza, which was pretty much a few months of 1918. And that is about 6% of India's population, which got wiped out in 1918. So these are horrific numbers and remarkably also swept clean from the collective memory of ourselves. When we learn this period in our school, it is about the rise and fall of British rule. It is not really about pandemics. And yet, actually, the people at that time, it's almost like writing the history of 2020, 100 years later on, and saying, oh, in that year, Trump lost an election. We know that the larger context of 2020 was the pandemic. And it's remarkable how pandemics often get forgotten in history. We should have remembered this history because last year we saw these horrific visuals of a migration crisis, which was set by a national lockdown. And remarkably, you had very similar scenes seen back more than 100 years back as well. Migrant workers fleeing cities, for instance. This is an image from the plague of 1897. It's one of the most stylized facts of pandemics in India because we have millions of migrant workers who have one leg in the village, one leg in the city. And when there's a health crisis, they want to go back home, not only for economic reasons, but a cultural imperative of this psychological kind of response, which says, agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge. And this was heard in last year on the railway station, and this was exactly what was heard in 1897 as well. Which means what we need to better plan our restriction or lockdown strategies so that we take into the consideration of migrant workers. And of course, there has been learning from 2020 to 2021. Since this is of interest to pharmaceutical firms, The vaccination success of 100 years back should also be remembered, just as we are recording massive vaccination doses in the last few weeks. This is the Haskell Institute, and Haskell Institute became some sort of a star in the world of plague vaccines. They started manufacturing, this is Bombay-based institute. Valdemar Haskell was the hero back then, much like Adar Poonawalla today. Valdemar Haskell was the hero back then, and I'm putting this Times of India 1934 article headline on top, which said Haskell's plague vaccine, what it has meant to India. And you see very similar headlines today about how India's initially vaccines were exported, but how important these vaccines are in India. And what I'm pointing out again is that there's a link between the two. The Poonawallas were horse breeders. They were never into vaccine making, but they liaised with the Haskell Institute for actually antidotes for their, for snake bites for their horses. And that's how they backwardly integrated into vaccine production. There's a link between the vaccines, pharmacy stars of the previous, pandemics and today. There's a clear link between that age of pandemics and the current one. And finally, of course, the epidemiology. Last year, after the first wave, it's almost like COVID had never hit us. There was this tremendous sense of erasure of memory. These are two different charts, one of 1918 and one of last year. But I just wanted to see the difference between the first and the second wave. And these are just reported deaths. The actual deaths, as we know, are much more than reported deaths. But in 1918, you'll see each line being a district. Just see the difference between the first and the second wave. What we know from past pandemics is that pandemics come in waves. The plague lasted in India for 25 years. It was also seasonal in that case. But the flu ripped through India, thankfully only 2 waves, in other countries also 3 and 4 waves. But the steepness of the curve, the flattening of the curve along the y-axis rather than the x-axis is really critical out here. And finally, the economic devastation. If you see this chart, the x-axis is GDP growth rate, y-axis is inflation. There are 2 takeaways from this. The 2 worst years of Indian economic history have both been pandemic years. 1918, the influenza, and 2020, in both of which GDP contracted by about 10%. Pandemics also tend to be inflationary. This is also kind of a thing which I learned from my research, because supply side kind of issues, supply chains are tossed into, completely out of gear. And that's why there's a kind of pressure on prices to rise. And finally, about the role of companies and so on. This is an ad from an Ayurvedic firm in 1918. Obviously, it's important that you have, solid evidence-based arguments as to what works. As you can see in this ad, influenza is cured in 1 day. It clearly was not. In fact, in 1918, people thought influenza was bacteria. The science of virology had not even developed. In fact, what people realized was influenza was only 8 decades later, when research found it out. And so that also brings into question the responsibility of medicine firms and so on in providing actual antidotes which work. I'll end with this chart of what happened this year. And unfortunately, like in 1918, we saw this massive mortality surge. Again, unfortunately, this year, making India one of the most affected countries in the world today. And that makes me think, if we had really learned from the past pandemics, we would have known that pandemics come in waves and we have to be on our guard. We can't let the guard go down. B, that it will lead to an economic devastation, and how do we kind of mitigate that? C, it will affect migrant workers. How do we mitigate that? This is not just learning from what we've gone through in the last 1 year. All of this has happened earlier as well. I'm happy to take this conversation forward now.
Thank you, Chinmay. I think if you look forward from the age of pandemics to the most recent century, there'll be more lessons of similar nature coming from other epidemics and pandemics, be it MERS or SARS, etc. Quite insightful what you shared, and also the excerpts from your book. In fact, reminds me of a famous aphorism from French critic from that same era, actually, Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Carr, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. The similarities are shocking, especially because we don't seem to have remembered and applied them in how we deal with the current wave. Hopefully your book helps remind us of some of that, and also carried forward in the future pandemics that are to come, which only seem more likely than not, given the global challenges we face with the number of infectious diseases coming upon us. Perhaps taking from what you've done and the research you've done and looking to capture some of the learnings from the past, maybe worth reflecting on a few major themes, if you will, that matter, that apply over the period of time. all of them deeply interconnected. Let's look at globalization, technology, infrastructure, not only medical, but also the broader infrastructure to support the large populations of the world, medicine, therapies, vaccines, diagnostics, and what have you. And lastly, the economy. And maybe it's worth covering them one at a time to understand what's changed from them then from 100 years ago, what's similar, and how we can solve for it going forward. Would you like to start with globalization, Chinmay? Share some thoughts on what you've learned?
Sure. There's no doubt that globalization has its pros and cons, especially with epidemic diseases. The more interconnected we live, the more likely that the diseases will spread around the world at the drop of a hat. So what happened from Wuhan quickly spread around the world in record time. When cholera broke out in 1817 in eastern India, an unusually virulent strain, it took 1.5 years for it to reach Sri Lanka, and then a decade really to reach Europe, and another, a few years before it reached Mexico. Today, we are talking of literally a few weeks before a pandemic can consume the world. That's because we have the railways, we have the airplanes, we have the steamships, everything which was not there in 1817. Having said that, even in the past, in pre-globalized worlds, there have been epidemics unusually virulent, which have also devastated populations. I'm thinking of the Black Death in Europe, where tens of millions were killed. We're talking of 1348, which is a completely non-globalized world, so to speak. But even with some human contact, we're saying that, yes, it is going to intensify. But the alternative, that you are not connected at all, does not mean that epidemics have not ripped through your populations. In fact, there's also an argument to be made that the more interconnected you are, the more you kind of get some immunity to some exposure to some of these diseases. So I'm now thinking of the smallpox pandemic of the 16th and 17th century. When smallpox arrived in the Americas from Europe, entire populations were wiped out because they were never ever exposed to this disease. So there is an element of if you're saying, we should live, maybe globalization has its downfall. Of course, yes, epidemic diseases are going to travel much faster. But the counter, that the globalization or deglobalization, globalization will help us against prevention of diseases, I'm not too sure about that as well, because I think some exposure, to these diseases in the very long run, because what we know of complete wipeouts is precisely those societies which were never exposed to diseases of the brain. So there are various shades of this. What we do know are the benefits of globalization. The fact that we could develop a vaccine in record time is, of course, the stark reminder. The fact that it could go around the world, the ideas that can circulate around the world in record time, the fact that in a crisis like this, oxygen requirements were literally airlifted into India is also the sign of globalization. And of course, globalization at its basic is about reducing poverty through trade. India and China have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the last 30 years. That's one of the greatest human achievements. And note, nothing works better for epidemic diseases than malnutrition. So the starting point is India was an autarkic country, before 1991. But we had, even today malnutrition is pretty high, but we were even severely, poverty rates were much higher, death rates were much higher then. Even in an autarkic world, communicable diseases formed over 60% of deaths in India. Today, that number is less than 30%. So I'm, as you can see, trained as an economist, and I tend to favor globalization. Having said that, of course, there are these downfalls, but I think we need to move to a situation where there's better surveillance. I think that is really the key out here. And there's no doubt that COVID has shown us how devastating it can be to the global economy. Should we then hence necessarily move to a completely self-sufficient form of economic system? I don't think so, but there's no doubt that the oxygen cylinders, for example, it seems like the pandemic issue, there's some basics that every country needs to stock up with. Just like, as I like to point out, in the 1960s, we had a food crisis. Today, we have a food surplus country. 1991, we had a foreign exchange crisis. Today, we are a forex surplus country. This year, we had an oxygen crisis, medical oxygen crisis. Now, I do think we should be in a position where we produce a lot of medical oxygen, for instance. And of course, there are different elements of the supply chain involved in COVID that needs to be ramped up. But broadly, I'm still net positive on globalization.
I couldn't agree more with you, Chinmay. It's always a trade-off, isn't it? but definitely the benefits far outweigh some of the challenges it might pose. And what you're also saying is, from history, it's not as if the lesser extent of globalization kept away the globalization of the disease. It was a matter of time. And to add to the benefits that you just said, the reality is, even as we look at vaccines or therapies of other kinds, tests, the supply chain is global. Yeah. What makes a vaccine is not sourced from one place. So we could not only the research and development, but also the manufacturing, we could not have done at such speed without that global network, if you will, and the collaboration across multiple stakeholders, which we'll talk about in a little bit in further detail. But one of the things you also mentioned is the sharing of information, the surveillance, and the technology at play, right? Ultimately, technology, which is the second theme I'd like to pick upon, has played and is continuing to play a huge role, more often than not an enabler, and perhaps posing a challenge on the context of information in a couple of areas, which perhaps we need to look at. It's enabled how we work. So a large part of the economy is still quite unaffected because we're able to keep everything running with the virtual way of working, with telemedicine and telehealth more broadly. R&D, manufacturing, all have been truly enabled because of technology, the speed made possible. Infrastructure on so many levels have been strengthened with technology. The level of information that's available, surveillance, as you reflected, I think 1952 is when the WHO first set up the global surveillance system for flu. And looking at it now, we are at a completely different stage where we have information on our fingertips on the caseload, of course, based on the reporting accuracy, but still the level of information that technology is enabled is incredible. And of course, there is the social media as a source of information, the good and the bad. So truly a lot of benefits from technology as well, which I suspect, and this is the question back to you, is quite a different reality from the world that you studied from the age of the pandemics.
Absolutely. You know, my book covers this period 1817 to 1920. In 1817, you'd be surprised to know, Western medicine, the kind of roots of bacteriology were not known. There was really no advantage that Western medicine gave over Ayurvedic systems, over Unani, and the British troops were dying in large numbers in the early 19th century to tropical diseases rather than warfare and so on. Interestingly, the way I see the development of modern technology itself owes its roots to the age of pandemics, especially of the late 19th century. The great discoveries of people like Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, the pioneers of this field, this entire invention of bacteriology, and then after that virology. Some of the leading questions in their mind was, how do we end diseases? And that's really and one of the key diseases they were obsessed about was cholera. You mentioned the World Health Organization. The intellectual roots of the World Health Organization start with an international conference in 1851, where their basic objective is to stop cholera from leaving the Indian subcontinent and reaching Europe. And there are a series of conferences held after that for over 70 years, and that movement eventually culminates into the World Health Organization. So technology has been very important. Understanding technology, understanding the disease framework, the ecology, getting good data on that, all of this has been very integral. And my book ends in 1920 for a particular reason, not just because influenza ended there. The life expectancy rate in India until then was in the 20s, which means if you were born, you could expect to live only about 20 years. Today, we can expect to live about 70 years at birth. That is the phenomenal achievement of modern technology, especially after 1920, whether it's antibiotics in the 1940s, where we have started getting down the share of communicable diseases in our deaths from something like 90% to now less than 30%. So the period 1920 to 2020 is one of, in a kind of human history scale of the Indian subcontinent, truly epochal. That is, we've added 50 years to the average human life, and that is the power of technology. So I just point out again, when the pandemic started, I tweeted saying that we should remember 1918, and somebody said, look, nothing like that can ever happen again because we have modern technology. And I think that's also where we have to be a bit cautious, as the Nobel Prize winning biologist Joshua Lederberg says, that it's parasites, microbes, they're an evolutionary bodies. they are going to evolve, and it's a constant tussle between the human body and this. It's quite likely that we can never eradicate pandemics, but we have to make them less lethal, and that's where technology is really pushing us.
And maybe one of the observations I have on this is, despite all the technology, one of our realizations, starting with Europe, especially Italy, and culminating with our second wave just a few months ago, is infrastructure. We realized that our infrastructure is woefully inadequate to deal with a circumstance like this, be it in developed markets or developing countries alike. Perhaps in India, we experienced it with much more pain than some of the other countries, but there is a consistent theme here. And I'm talking about infrastructure from prevention, sanitation, and what have you, the everyday infrastructure for everyday life, public health, healthcare for diagnostics, vaccines, treatment, equipment. You mentioned oxygen earlier, bed capacity, and even the ability to switch to home healthcare. There was a lot of gaps we identified, not easy to address in the immediate term. And while people many stakeholders rose to the occasion and dealt with the crisis in the best way possible, these were patchwork solutions rather than holistic long-term infrastructure. So the question of how we address this for the long term in thinking about the health infrastructure across the spectrum in the context of One Health, seeing more and more the connection between humans, animals, the environment, etc., becomes more and more important, and connecting that to the stakeholder collaborations. How do we make sure some of the collaborations that started now across the stakeholders in the system is something that continues? Because without the infrastructure being systematized and made sustainable, it'll be hard to reactivate it in the longer term when the next pandemic is upon us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've been reminded of our woeful infrastructure, not so much by wave 1 in India, but by wave 2, when I think pretty much everyone in India had said the system had collapsed, and we were on our WhatsApp forwards trying to help each other out. Interestingly, I found a very similar thing in 1918. They didn't have WhatsApp back then, but they had letters to the editor, and they were writing in letters saying, not to the government for help, civil society. And so when the system breaks down, civil society kind of stands up. There are, I think, many aspects of infrastructure. As a person trained in economics, obviously the major one is funding. I think one of the biggest failures of multiple governments from the British times to now has been the woeful spending on health infrastructure in India. And we have said at India, there's a problem because we say that health is a state level subject. And so you get different responses at the state level. But yet, even if you add up all of that, it's a very tiny fraction of our overall GDP. I think Brazil spends something like 5 or 10 times more. There are countries which have vastly superior health outcomes precisely because they're spending more on the health infrastructure. Now, you look at that from urban and rural areas, the differences are even more stark. That's why wave 2 hit us really badly this year, partly because in rural areas, you're out completely on your own. And the health infrastructure has a supply side issue, but there is also a demand side issue, which is there in the past, hopefully not today. And that is that many people are content with very, very traditional time-tested forms of getting access to healthcare, which might be comforting, but not actually practically useful. And that is also a problem out here where people are trying to supply good healthcare infrastructure, but there's not adequate demand. So like anything in economics, there's a demand side issue and a supply side issue. But India, there's no doubt, has failed miserably in the last 70, I would say 150 years on the investment front. In 1918, after the crisis, many people in the newly constituted Legislative Assembly, Indian members said, this is it, this is the time to change. There were more hospitals built after that, and most famously, the word sanitary commissioner was changed to the public health commissioner. So the word sanitation gets changed to public health because of the 1918 crisis. And yet when you actually look, I think the thing with pandemics is that while we say it's a wake-up call, but it also slips out very quickly from our memory. And unfortunately in India, health has never really been a political issue. People have not gone saying, inflation is a political issue, a lot of other things are political issues, but people have not really gone to the population saying, we will fix your healthcare system. And so there is also a political angle to this. And hopefully one of the things that the pandemic does, that is my hope, is that it really awakens people saying that, look, here are political options, and these are political options who are going to fix our healthcare system. And some of them really take that up. And that, I think that, because at the end of the day, you get such infrastructure, of course, from private players, but there has to be good state level backing. You need that investment. And so it's a very long drawn out game. But there's no doubt we've been exposed in a way, unfortunately, this year, and that we really have miles to go before we can claim. On the one hand, we can vaccinate, a crore people a day, 10 million people in a day. And on the other hand, we fail at some of the very basic stuff in health. It's a paradox of the Indian system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One more element, perhaps, you mentioned this earlier, the burden of non-communicable diseases has become much greater than that of the infectious diseases in the recent past. And that might have lulled us into a little bit of complacency there as well. And I think what we are realizing is infectious disease broadly, especially in this globalized world we live in, are here to stay, and we can't neglect them. It's a matter of cyclicality, but the investments in infrastructure as well as medicine is necessary to maintain if we are to cope with what many are predicting will be a more frequent cycle of epidemics and pandemics in the years to come. Yeah, and I think that's a segue into medicine, if you will. But you were going to say something, Chinmay.
I'm just going to say, yeah, there's also an issue about who does it hurt. Like you said, the infectious disease, 30% of those deaths today does not hurt the rich of India. Diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, they're not killing people as much as they are in the bottom segments. Now the pandemic, because it's affected, people across classes, I think that's one of the reasons why communicable diseases are back on the agenda. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's gone out of fashion for people to focus, because that's not how the rich are dying anymore. So I think that's the issue out there. Yeah.
It's a fair point. I guess pandemics are more inclusive in their nature, if you will. And so essentially the figuring out of the balance of investments, be it in the context of infrastructure, but also medicine, right? I think the pharmaceutical industry, speaking of medicine, has this in the last 20 months truly upped the ante. And I say that with pride as a member of the pharmaceutical industry. What's happened in the last 20 months has been nothing short of inspirational in terms of the speed with which all companies have put resources together, multiple stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem, not just pharma, but also medtech, but also many technology players, yeah, coming together to expedite. On the other side, multi-sectoral, public, private, governments, international development organizations, non-profits, etc., coming together to look at ways to speed up innovation so that we can tackle with the challenge sooner rather than later. I suspect, looking back into history as you did, of course, there was activity then, but the level of innovation we have now and the level of acceleration is at an entirely different level. And the hope is that with this level of technology, medicine, science at our fingertips, we should be able to get past this second, third, fourth wave, depending on which country we're talking about, rather quickly. And then hopefully we maintain those investments in a way that we don't have to start from scratch in the future.
That's, a very important point. And I think a huge difference between what I documented in the age of pandemics and today is precisely the significance of pharmaceutical firms in making I think that the key is not the existence of the firm. There were pharma companies back then as well. The difference is not the scale of operations, it's just the rapidity. We just, by the time Hafkin invents his cholera plague vaccine, to the time it comes onto the market, to the time he gets cleared of some fraudulent charges and so on, by the time the plague vaccine is acceptable, with the plague pandemic is almost over, it's been 25 years, and then there's a lot of acceptance in the 1920s. So we have really, I would say the word is time compression, like you said, the 20 months, and it's a good case study for us in a management school to study as to how the pharmaceutical players have really got into the act right now. And I do think a key thing out here is, of course, a sense of a collective goodwill that we have to do something, and how do we contribute towards it. The last aspect I'd point out is philanthropy. I think that's also a kind of in a crisis. When we say all arms have to work, philanthropy is a kind of underappreciated sense, and philanthropy of pharmaceutical firms and beyond is, I think, quite laudable in this pandemic. There was, of course, back then as well, but I think the scale is something different. At least, I'm very active on Twitter, and you see some of the leading, heads of pharma firms, of big corporates in India, out there saying, we will do this, just give us the problem and we will break it down. So there was this kind of sense of calling, which I definitely did not see, that much. And as I said, there were a lot of fraudulent claims, back then. Maybe it's better regulation now, so that's one thing. The only flip side, of course, of this is that I do think, given the rapidity and given the uncertainty, given that we can't measure side effects, long-term effects, there is also a sense of caution that has to be exercised. And I think, especially during the second wave, I think we did see a breakdown of what medicines work. All sorts of things were recommended, and then we got the side effects of that. So there was a kind of escalation. And I think if only we had some good protocols followed out there, if there's clarity. I think there was uncertainty, but if there was clarity, many people were wondering why some drugs which were recommended today is not recommended the next week. So that sort of confusion, I do think, it's if you're recommending a drug, you better be sure about, you're taking a risk, but you have certain evidence to back it. If you're going to withdraw it, that's going to create a lot of fear and confusion. And so that is the only thing that one has to keep in mind. There's no doubt that the pharma industry has responded so creatively and proactively in this crisis.
Absolutely. Two questions for you, Chinmay. One's from the audience. I'm looking at the questions as they come. I think when in the heat of the moment, the contributions of the industry were well recognized and lauded. But not very long after, there is a lack, I'm reading the question, paraphrasing it, there is a lack of let's say, gratitude is a word used here, but also the benefit of the political will to recognize the good that these companies bring, and then to give pharmaceutical industry or the medtech industry as well the benefit of doubt and the gratitude and appreciation, so that the value that they bring is recognized. Why do you think there is a little bit of an apathy to that when things settle down? Any perspectives there?
I think, again, I'm going to put my social science hat on and say that, this is like a political economy question. If you see what happened last year in March 2020, I think the Prime Minister very quickly realized that the global supply chains are going to stop, and we got this word Atmanirbhar. This was an important part of that thing. So I think there are two issues out here. One is that there's definitely been much more focus on the domestic, and in that kind of whole thing, MNCs in particular, if you're talking a lack of gratitude, I think that could be one of the things. Though, I find it, quite strange, because even if you look at Serum Institute, it's in partnership with, other agencies. So obviously there's global cooperation at every level, Gavi, and it's just so many things that are there. So my sense is that there's a larger political economy at work, which is basically gunning for domestic Indian firms, which has its, again, shades of what we saw in the 1970s and so on. From an economist, as I said, who favors globalization, this is slightly distressing. So I share, if indeed it is a case of lack of gratitude, that would be, of course, disturbing. Having said that, the overall business milieu in the last 2 years have, in my view, been positive. So you can say that, okay, for the pharma industry might be, or certain segments of the pharma industry are not getting certain goodwill. But look at the broader picture. Corporate tax rates have been slashed massively, right? So that's a straight benefit if you're registered in the company in India. Huge benefits, a windfall gain for companies through that, move. So overall, I don't think there's much actually for corporates in India to be complaining. That's my personal take as an economist, rather than a person working on history on this. And I'm sure, sector by sector within the pharma industry, there might be grouses. There are, of course, lockdown-related issues. If your plant happens to be in a district in a lockdown, there are different sorts of relations out there. But I think pharma companies have been very flexible, and a lot of them have held up very well. There are studies now which show that big corporates, especially, the profits actually increased during the pandemic. All sorts of things that happened for some of the big firms.
And I think and that ongoing investment and communication in what's being done for the sake of improving health across the board is a good action for us to take. The second paradox that you mentioned is during the second wave, there was an almost impossible to imagine use of medications of all kinds without proven benefit risk profile. On the other hand, there is still a lot of vaccine hesitancy that we see, with a large number of people not comfortable getting vaccinated, despite knowing the much worse risk benefit profile of actually contracting COVID. Why do you think that is? Going back to you gave the example from also the past pandemics, and what can we do about it? How do we come together to solve for that as well?
It's a good question. Of course, this is what squarely is in the realm of something called behavioral economics. That is, how does the mind work? Now, if you contract, there's a difference between you living in a state where you have the virus and where you don't have the virus. So think of the first part, that is, why are people willing to take all sorts of medications, is precisely because they or their loved ones have the virus. And then the vaccine hesitancy part is precisely because they don't have the virus. They are kind of estimating the cost benefits very, very differently, and they're conditioned, many people are conditioned due to a variety of misinformation in my view, and so on. So from a purely kind of economist take, the demand for any medicine is actually very rational because you want to get well. And in that, of course, a lot of mistakes, or what we call a mental heuristics, take a beating. I teach a course at IIM Ahmedabad called Pandemics, and it's the second iteration of the course. And we have discussions on these things. And a lot of students have said, no, sir, but I took this medicine, and though while they said it didn't work, it worked because I got well. And of course, when you look at the numbers, even if you took Maggi noodles, you will probably recover, in the sense that it's not causal element of that thing working. The case fatality rates of COVID are actually so small at certain age groups that virtually anything you have will get you through the disease at a certain level. So I think it's really, I think it's a very good question, but they're two completely different mental modes. And that's why what we need is, in that crisis phase, we needed much more clarity in terms of exactly what works, much more. Of course, there was government communication on a daily basis, but we know that the protocols changed, and that should definitely ideally not happen in a pandemic. As I said, it's okay to release or recommend a drug later on, and people might criticize you, why didn't you recommend it 2 weeks back? I think that's a safer approach, by saying, okay, now this works, and then 3 weeks later saying, oh, this we're withdrawing. I think that's a very dangerous, because that creates more confusion and more take. The other part is very interesting on vaccine hesitancy. It's been there throughout history, across societies. The only way to do this is really, what we say is community level responses, where you sit down, if you're an organization, sit down with your employees and say, look, this is the risk benefit, cost benefit profile, and vaccines are going to work. I think now the challenge is, especially after the second wave in India. In a way, of course, a lot of the vaccine hesitancy is reduced because of the second wave. People know the intensity. So, so people, there's a clamor for vaccines on that. But for those who are hesitant, and I should say that, I have converted a lot of people around me. I think we should also take this up at the individual level to kind of see people who are saying, I have not taken vaccines. How do we convert such people? I think the key is to point out that, look, it's quite likely that COVID is going to be around for some time. And really the only way going forward, a huge part of getting our lives back on order, because everyone wants their life back in the pre-COVID kind of a time, is vaccination. I think that has to be made clear to business houses. If you're an employee and if you're a small shop and if you're hesitant to take the vaccine, you have to say, look, do you want to get your business on track? Vaccine is a huge part of that story. The other question people are getting now is, even if you take the vaccines, you might get the infection, and that's a valid point. So then why take the vaccine? And there, I think one really has to say that, look, the whole part of this vaccination is to also reduce the load in the health system. With arguably 70-80% vaccinated population, you're not going to see the kind of visuals that we saw in April and May this year. I think it's as clear as that. So there's no doubt that a huge part of our focus going forward is that. Now, the numbers are very good as of now on a daily basis. We are projected to hit many of the targets by the end of the year. The supplies seem to be good. But I think in a month from now, you will find that the last leg of the population will include a lot of the vaccine hesitant people. And overcoming that part is going to be a critical challenge in especially November and December.
Absolutely. So one of the approaches you described, which resonates with me, is not very different from the NCDs with the non-communicable diseases, where ultimately it's all about benefit risk, especially when we talk about lifestyle diseases. Yeah, the complacency to not get treated and deal with the impact of the disease is not small in diabetes or heart failure or cardiovascular disease or stroke, etc. So how do we get to the grassroots level? Education, even taking it as personal responsibilities, what you're saying could help with address some of that. And in addition, collaborative approaches to communicate might also help. Let's come back to the power of information and how we make this happen in a minute, but let's touch upon the fifth element we discussed, which is the economy. Yeah, ultimately, economies have been impacted globally, some worse than others. I would suspect that the impact in this pandemic may be less so than the past pandemics, just because a large part of the sectors, large number of sectors actually can function and operate even despite the pandemic, with technology having enabled work, virtual work, etc. But one observation that I think is often discussed is the hundreds of millions of more people that have been pushed into poverty, and the significantly widened chasm between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, and the reality that for those who have fallen into poverty or have been in poverty, it will take over a decade to bring them back, whereas some of the billionaires have regained their pre-pandemic wealth already in the course of the pandemic. So looking back into history as well, what's your view on what it takes to survive through this and more consistently across all aspects of the economy, get us back on some level of equal footing, if you will?
Yeah. Interestingly, some pandemics in the past have been good for the survivors, however cruel it sounds. For example, the 1918 pandemic, which wiped off 6% of Indian population, the bulk of them being laborers. What happens if there's a sufficiently high level of mortality, from an economics perspective, the labor capital ratio changes. We saw that last year in Bombay when migrant workers went back. For a very brief period, their bargaining power had gone up. Right? So when you have massive mortality surges, sometimes what happens after the pandemic is actually people who died, the people who have survived have actually better bargaining power to work with. That's not the case in this pandemic. This is a pandemic which has had much more of an economic devastation than, of course, the mortality impact, which is large. We are estimating 3 million deaths in India, which is a large number. But as a percentage of 1.4 billion people, it is not 6%, which is what we saw in 1918. So that's the first thing, that pandemics of the past wiped out a much higher percentage of the population. As a result, the pandemic itself kind of recalibrated, the power relations between, say, employers and employee after that. Now that's not happening this time. We've had the lockdowns. We've had a tiny percentage of the overall population, perish as compared to past pandemics. But the lockdowns have been for so long. We have good studies on employment surveys. Unemployment rates have gone up, which means that the economic devastation has been, very large. And I should say also a big difference between this pandemic and last pandemic is the coordinated lockdowns that happen around the world. It has never happened before. And the April lockdown of last year was so stringent that it really knocked out the economy, as we know now, about 8% contraction over the year. Now, how do we get out of it? That is the bigger question. So the government of India has recognized this essentially as a supply side problem, which to a certain extent is useful because, as I said, pandemics do have, when we say supply side rather than demand side, it means there are inflationary pressures. So supply sides have been hit. And so you'd say the response of the government has been more on the supply side. But the fact is that with the lockdown, when your incomes dry up, you basically also have a demand side shock, right? So if you see prices in India, how do you know if it's a demand side or supply side? It would seem like a supply side shock. It would seem like the government of India is responding well, but that's for firms. There's a huge part of India, especially migrant workers who I work a lot on as a topic, who have had a massive demand shock, which means their purchasing power has gone down. And that's why I do think that there's a huge case for a fiscal stimulus now, directly into the hands of people, into what we call as universal basic transfer, a variety of other means. Other governments around the world have done it at a much bigger scale. We have been fiscally conservative in the last 10 or 20 years, so we don't want to go down that route too much. But I do think there's a case now to be made because the numbers are very stark. You can look at the Zimbabwe University report on employment. The biggest declines in income, if you put it across a gradient, the biggest declines have happened among the poorest. Inequality has increased. There was a hope initially that with work from home, women will be able to participate more in the workforce. In India, unfortunately, it's completely opposite. Ashwini Deshpande's work shows a bigger withdrawal of the labor force from women than men. So the labor market has been affected at different ends. It's been much worse for women in India than men. It's been much worse for the poor. And that's why you need to have these targeted measures. The measures are good so far at the supply side level, but I've not really seen any measures at the demand side level. And that needs a fundamental recalibration, in my view.
Clearly, one of the key takeaways and suggestions coming from you. Yesterday, as we were just discussing before the fireside chat today, Chinmay, we talked about a few other success factors, if you will, that we need to focus on to get out of this pandemic. And we mentioned a few. Information, we talked about the power of information and misinformation and how to manage. We talked about it a little bit, looking at the clock, maybe we leave it there. You also mentioned yesterday the need for metrics and measurement with objectivity and accuracy. Can you elaborate a bit on that, on what it takes, and also to align on the very conflicting views on how metrics can be interpreted by different stakeholders, if you will?
Yeah, I think what past pandemics have shown us above all is that you can't end a pandemic without some sort of, herd immunity is one way to end a pandemic. Ideally, you don't want to go down that route if it kills too many people. But if you want to end a pandemic with prevention and cure or vaccination, you have to have good data. You need to have good data on how many people are infected. You need to have good data on how many people are dying. You need to have good data on how many people are saved by the vaccines and so on. The cholera pandemic ended because John Snow figured it out that it's waterborne. They invested in good water systems, and that is how cholera is no longer a dangerous disease in our lives. Plague, people figured out the transmission. A huge part of that story was cutting transmission. Today, I would say we are lacking data in India on certain key metrics. On a daily basis, we get three metrics. We get reported COVID cases, reported COVID deaths, and the vaccination numbers thanks to the COVID app. All this is useful, but the larger picture comes from two metrics which we are not doing regularly at all, and that is seroprevalence and what we call as excess deaths, which means because a lot of people are not testing positive and then they're not classified as COVID dead, but we know a lot of people have died. And if you look at the seroprevalence number, 68% of India has already been exposed. If you look at the excess deaths number, we have an estimate of about 3 million, not 430,000. The government is saying. Now, how does having a more accurate measurement help, especially pharma industry? One is you get a sense of how many people are actually infected. Now that's important because we're now talking of long COVID, and you have a huge pharmaceutical response to long COVID. For that, you need to know how many people were actually exposed to the virus. And the reported numbers, I'm afraid, simply no clue to that. They are not all, and I would say the metrics we have right now, not only, they are useful to say, okay, September was a peak of last year and May was the peak of this year. Yes, it's useful for the broad trend, but it's not giving a sense of the magnitude of the crisis on the pandemic in India. And we can't really end the pandemic unless we have good metrics. So my humble plea is that, we need to put pressure at various levels or collect our own data. Pharma companies, for example, need to conduct studies on efficacies of, how much is natural immunity giving you protection, how much is medicine giving you protection, how much is the vaccine providing protection. Better data leads to better solutions. I'm a huge votary of that. And I do think that's one place we're lagging. For example, in the UK now, you have regular seroprevalence. Strain tracking is another thing, but I think we're doing better on that now. But the UK puts out deaths at a fortnightly level, at the county level, all-cause mortality. We're not providing all-cause mortality because people are dying of COVID, but they're also dying of other things. All of that gets captured in all-cause mortality. And so we need a much sharper focus on that. And I think that's going to be very useful, especially for the pharma industry, to make an accurate assessment, for example, on how many medicines to stock up. How do you make such things based on the reported case? Take another example. Which states are more affected? If you ask me, I've been tracking this pandemic for 1.5 years on a daily basis. The state ordering right now does not, I'm afraid, tell you the picture of COVID in India. You can't understand what's happening in Kerala today without understanding the overall exposure. Kerala had less exposure then, and it's being more exposed now, and that's why you're seeing the cases. But a lot of people think, oh, others have controlled it well. But they allowed the exposure to reach to 70%. Kerala has not done that, and is unfortunately now going towards that. So only when you get the wider context of the pandemic can anybody make serious plans, whether it's the government, whether it's industry, and whether it's pharma. And that's why metrics are key.
Absolutely fair point, and I think a clear call to action that you've made here. I think another call to action I would add is the power of collaboration. Yeah, I think like never before, the last 20 months have shown us what is possible if the different stakeholders across the ecosystem of that One Health, multidisciplinary, public, private, government, international development, NGOs, the private sector, pharma, medtech, etc., coming together. We've seen what is possible. I think the risk here is there is nowhere to go but down, because we've really reached a huge crescendo of impact. And challenge and call to action is, how do we keep this alive so that we don't go back to old ways in the new normal, but learn to leverage and harness the power of collaboration in a way that is ultimately designed for the broader good of the society, while each of the stakeholders also benefit from and get to their own individual objectives as well. Your thoughts on that, Chinmay, before we open up for Q&A as well?
Yeah, I think there's been tremendous collaboration, but I would say much of that success of the collaboration has been at the more sub-government level. It's been more across industries, across countries, across firms, across individuals. But unfortunately, the reality is also that we live in this, particular polarized world in terms of politics, where we know, for example, that there's vaccine inequity. The US is stocking up on booster doses where a lot of countries don't have vaccines at all. So collaboration has been fantastic in developing the vaccines. I think we need more collaboration for dissemination of those vaccines. And in particular, I think India, I think there's a huge controversy in India whether we should have exported those vaccines or not in Jan or Feb. I do think we'll be very soon in a position where we can really export around the world. And that is where, again, collaboration is key. And I think India has a huge role to play in kind of vaccinating many countries around the world next year after we've done our own thing. But not just vaccines, the entire pharma ecosystem in India, I think, has a huge role to play, not just for the Indian audience, but just the entire world. And especially because so many countries are looking at their own markets, the scope for Indian pharma firms who are operating here and collaborating outside is tremendous. For multinationals who are based around the world, in any case, collaboration is very natural. It's part of the DNA in those firms. But I just found that one cautionary note that we need more collaboration to get the vaccines around, because as somebody has said, the pandemic is not over until it's over everywhere, and I think Absolutely. That's a big point to make.
Absolutely. And you talked about collaboration along multiple aspects as a question from the audience around what this means. Yeah, so one of the challenges has been some of the political discussion has also gone towards pinpointing one source of origin, if you will, and that can come in the way of solutioning, if you will. Yeah, ultimately, it's important to know the root cause so we can prevent in the future, but also going towards solutioning. That's part one of the question. And part two is, if it is indeed animal origins, how do we, when we talk about One Health as well, how do we start to connect the link between humans and animals, if you will, and transfer of viruses?
Yeah, the second part is easier in the sense that, firstly, I'm not qualified to speak about it. My training in economics and history, I think best answered by, but I have been reading a lot about this. And I think all I can say is that this is one of the great, because as I understand, OPPI is research-based, collaborative kind of a industry initiative. The scope for research in that is just tremendous, and I think that's going to be one of the hottest places of doing.
And I could just chime in there, Chinmay, absolutely right. And in general, most of the pharmaceutical companies, Boehringer Ingelheim included, we are starting to move towards investing in the R&D from a One Health perspective, recognizing not only humans and animals, but also plants and the environment more broadly are closely connected, and we can't solve for one silo. We have to connect those parts of the ecosystem to solve for it. So that approach, One Health approach, should help us, but it's not an easy nut to crack, but it's continued investment towards that. But back to this first part of the question.
The question is, if the question is, what do we do with the source of origin and so on? I think the way I look at this is the pandemic is now on. There are, of course, ways to think about the origin, different theories. But what do we do as India. Suppose it is indeed the case of lab leak, because we're basically saying there are two theories now: the lab leak theory and a natural transfer kind of a theory. Suppose it is a lab leak theory. What do we do? It's a good question, and I think some of the best, smartest brains in the world should try and crack that question. But the fact is that if you're based in India right now, there's not much of what we can do on that. If it is indeed a lab leak, we have to be very careful then that our lab practices are top notch, because what can happen there can very well happen here. Note that the most accepted idea of where the Delta variant began is in Eastern Maharashtra right now, as far as I know. And so, and the Delta variant is really causing havoc around the world. Now, nobody's blaming India as of now, because we're saying Wuhan is, the kind of point of origin. But if somebody says, look, it's not the COVID, it's the Delta variant which matters, suddenly, we'll have to kind of cop flack for that. And that's why the overall answer is that we have to invest much more in checking, testing strains on I would say not only as a pandemic response measure, but is as a part of usual time measure. That is, we should be checking, have a routine measure, just like we have quarterly GDP estimates. We need to have, pretty much routine a checking of samples to see, what new things, potentially new things that we don't know are floating. I think that's the learning from this pandemic. Beyond that, pinpointing, it might make you what we call a schadenfreude. You kind of feel, oh, it was not our fault. If that makes you happy, fair enough. But that's not solving our issues today. Beyond at a particular level. The question is on reparations. In general, I'm against reparations. Whether the British should be paying us for colonialism, or whether China should be paying for this, or in general, I think reparations in general as an economic argument has rarely worked. I'm definitely not. Though of course there's been massive economic damage, but reparations is a very tricky idea. I mean, remember, for about 100 years, as I write in my book, cholera was called Indian cholera, just like as many call the virus as the Chinese virus. India was how many people see China today. It was seen as the source of pandemics for about 100 years. When Marquez wrote Love in the Time of Cholera, it was Indian cholera which they were talking about. That is how popular that kind of memory got. And we now know that, by the way, that not all cholera outbreaks of that century could be linked to India.
Absolutely.
So we have to be very careful. And that's why, in my book also, I don't call it the Spanish flu. I call it the 1918 influenza. Be very careful in how we call these diseases, because, disease can really, I think what history really tells you is that these things can happen from anywhere. And yes, of course, if people are actually making such stuff, that should be, that obviously has to be curtailed. But we have to up our game in India in order to ensure that such stuff doesn't happen. If you believe in lab leak theories, then we have to, the learning from that should be that we should ensure that such stuff doesn't happen from our labs.
So pinpointing the sources, whether the pandemic or the mutations, for the sake of managing, mitigating and solving, rather than trying to put the burden of the problem on a particular country, is what you're suggesting, which makes sense. Maybe we are out of time, but one last question to wrap this up, which may be a good way to wrap it, is the role of media, including social media, during the pandemic, as we get through it and hopefully get past it soon. Let's maybe wrap up with that question, which is quite pertinent today.
As part of this course I teach out here, I've got many people from the government, Dr. V.K. Paul, COVID Task Force Chair, and it's, a lot of the students have asked them the question. We had Barkha Dutt, who's from the media, on our thing. What's really interesting is how the government itself uses the media. I think that's, so one is of course misinformation per se, but the government also, we had Darsha Shah, who's from the Bombay Municipal Corporation, Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation. The governments also have realized the power of social media, right? So this is a game in which misinformation is there, but there's also a lot of information thrown out by governments, which is now arguably reaching much faster than before. So while misinformation, and by the misinformation has always been there in all pandemics, if you read my book, just tons of rumors about cholera, plague, 1918. It is almost human nature to gossip, to rumor, and so on. What's really truly remarkable now is the rapidity at which you can also correct and kind of enforce your kind of view, the government's view, very quickly. But there's no doubt that in a much more larger context, the media also has to be independent, which means the government obviously has to maintain law and order, pandemic management, But for example, on deaths, I've been personally very critical of the government on deaths. If you're trying to defend numbers which are simply not what the data is showing, then the media has a very important role to play. I know a lot of local media groups, and during the second wave, this was a big dilemma. Should the media be portraying positive news in a state of crisis or negative news? And this is an eternal media kind of debate. But I do think that it was important to lay out the scale of the crisis, if nothing to wake up people, saying that, look, we need to get our act in order. And I think the media, a lot of the media houses, I would say, did a good job. There's a lot of criticism saying, why are they showing these things, bad images and so on. But the fact is that if those images were not there, people would not remember them. And hopefully people are remembering and kind of reacting in the next few months. I'll end by pointing out that, in my research of the past pandemics, while there are a lot of photographs of cholera and plague, I have till date not come across a single photograph of the 1918 influenza pandemic. And we completely forgot that pandemic, partly because there's no visual memory of that pandemic. Just a few days back, the Prime Minister inaugurated the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, memorial site. That happened in April 1919. That was widely covered in the media back then, but that has been consistently covered in the media since over the next 100 years. And we still remember that tragedy. Now, that tragedy took a few hundred lives. A few months before that, 20 million Indians died. And that memory has been completely wiped out. And so ultimately, I would say the role of the media really, and the message of this book, is to say that, we have to build a collective memory. That stuff like natural immunity, for example, you could have immunity against certain things, but in general, no human body is completely immune to everything. And we have to be cautious and, on our guard. I think that's the broader message of the book of development. And media has a huge role to build up collective memory.
And I think the very positive thing about social media is it's quite democratic. We all have access to it, not only as readers, but also as authors and sharers of information. So as individuals, as companies, as organizations such as OPPI, we can also use it to spread the positive, spread the education, the information that is needed to get us past the pandemic as well. We're out of time. And with that, and hopefully, Chinmay, look forward to seeing your sequels, one for the last century, and then a reflection on this pandemic. So good luck to you. And with that, I hand over to you, Asawari.
Thank you. Thanks, Vani. Thanks, Chinmay, for such a lovely and insightful, engaging discussion. Seriously. I hope we've tried to answer all the questions from our participants. But looking at the time, I quickly hand it over to the Director General of OPPI, Mr. KG Ananthakrishnan, for a vote of thanks. So over to you, KG.
Thanks, Asawari. I think it was an outstanding session, to say the least. Professor Chinmay Tumbe, it was a wonderful learning, for people who haven't, studied this with such depth. I think this 1 hour capsule provided a phenomenal glimpse of what happens in pandemic. And thanks to you for that a wonderful way in which you brought it out, and particularly to you, Vani, the way that you brought in all the critical aspects that needs to get covered, whether it is globalization, whether it is infrastructure, technology, the role of medicines and the medical community, economy, the power of information, the power of metrics and measurement, as you talked about, and finally the collaboration. I think it was extremely well weaved in, into this discussion, covering, almost every key topic that we need to at least know about in a very nice summarized manner. So thanks to Professor Chinmay, and also to you, Vani, for this webinar to a